Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, has accused China of committing cultural genocide in his homeland. He was speaking after days of protests in which up to 80 people have been killed. But the Chinese government is disputing the numbers. It says it's shown massive restraint and that only 13 so-called innocent civilians died without the use of lethal force. A huge security presence has brought a tense calm to the streets of the Tibetan capital Lhasa tonight, but the trouble spread to three other Chinese provinces, Sichuan, Gansu and Qinghai, all of which have large Tibetan communities. And adding to the pressure on China, Tibetan exiles around the world have taken to the streets demanding an end to Chinese rule.
6 months out from the Olympics, it is the last thing the Chinese authorities needed. Protesters taking to the streets of the world's capitals to denounce China's crackdown in Tibet. In Brussels, police protecting the Chinese mission were caught off guard as protesters attacked the building. There were similar scenes outside the Chinese embassy in Paris, where police were forced to use pepper spray to keep the protesters at bay. But one man did get through, replacing the Chinese flag with Tibet's, to huge applause from the crowd. Pepper spray was used in the United States too, where there were a handful of arrests outside the Chinese embassy in Washington. Closer to Tibet itself, there were protests across India. One of the biggest was at Dharamsala, the home of the Tibetan government in exile. The demonstrations have been organised by younger Tibetans, frustrated by the Dalai Lama's conciliatory approach. But he has refused to call on the protesters to stop, saying it's China that must change its ways.
Whether intentionally or unintentionally, some kind of cultural genocide is taking place.
The comments will anger the Chinese authorities, but they'll be relieved that he didn't call for a boycott of the Olympics. The protests have spread to three other Chinese provinces with large Tibetan communities. Chinese-run businesses were the focus of the anger. In Gansu, eyewitnesses said police used tear gas to end the protest. At least 20 of them were rounded up overnight. Inside Tibet, the crackdown has had the desired effect. Tibetans cower in buildings as large numbers of Chinese reinforcements hunt them down. Tonight, the Chinese military is back in control of Tibet's streets, leaving the ethnic Chinese community to pick up the pieces. Most of those doing well in Tibet are migrants from other parts of China. They have no sympathy for the people in whose land they live.
的心情是非常沉重的，这些少数分裂分子，就你看吧，这都是他们搞的这个炮灰活动，就这都是我见证。你看，好日子不过，就这样。
China has given the protesters until midnight tonight to give themselves up. If they don't, they've been warned they'll be severely punished. Brian Thompson, World News Australia.
And we'll hear more from the Dalai Lama later in the program. The Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has urged China to exercise restraint as events unfold in Tibet and neighbouring Chinese provinces. But he's under pressure from minor political parties and pro-Tibetan activists to take stronger action in dealing with China.
They've been rocked by recent events in their homeland. Today, members of Sydney's Tibetan community were preparing for yet another protest tomorrow. Many are former political prisoners. 26-year-old Liu Sang was thrown in jail by Chinese police when just 15. He says his crime was watching his friend write a political slogan.
They just beat me. They are showing the guns. If you are not telling the truth, we are going to shoot you.
He says protesting is his way of showing support for those back home.
It's affecting me. It's just unexpressible feelings. Yeah, really hard.
The Prime Minister says what's happening in Tibet is disturbing.
I would call upon the Chinese authorities to exercise restraint.
He says he's already raised the issue via diplomatic channels and will speak with China's leaders when he visits next month. But Greens leader Bob Brown, who today moved an urgency motion to debate Tibet in the Senate, accused the Prime Minister of being effectively silent over the crackdown.
Our Prime Minister and this government has got to get some backbone over Tibet and speak up and look the Chinese communists dictatorship in the eye when Kevin Rudd gets to China.
The Democrats and Family First Senator Steve Fielding also urge Mr Rudd to lead the way on human rights. The federal opposition supports the government's stance.
Well, I think that this is a matter that Mr Rudd should be raising with the Chinese leadership when he visits China.
The Australia-Tibet Council says the time has passed for calls for restraint.
It's time now for the international governments to be calling on China to allow independent UN investigators into Tibet.
But it's welcomed what it says is the strongest public statements by an Australian government on China in a decade. Cassandra Hill, World News Australia.
Returning to Tibet now, and the Dalai Lama has expressed his concern about tonight's midnight deadline for protesters in Tibet to give themselves up. He says he fears there could be more killings.
Leader praying for peace. But the Dalai Lama is worried that there could be further killing to come. In an exclusive interview with the BBC here in his home in exile, he called the situation in Tibet desperate. China's repression, he said, must come to an end.
The stability, unity must come from heart, not simply physical control by force. It is the wrong method.
Everyone in Dharamshala hangs on his every word. He spoke of cultural genocide in Tibet and said he had reports of 100 people killed by Chinese security forces in the last few days.
They simply feel they have gone, so they can control. It's obviously they can control. But more suppression, more military occupation, more resentment.
But there's no sign that China is in the mood to listen. The Dalai Lama admits that he feels a little helpless. I'm worried, anxious, he said, about the Chinese deadline for protesters to surrender by midnight on Monday. But the one thing he does have, both here and around the world, is moral authority. As night falls, Tibetan exiles take to the streets. A younger generation, both here and in Tibet, more impatient for change. And in this Olympic year, determined to be heard.